Hi guys, welcome to the session on Coffee with Prabh. And today we have a special guest, Vasanthkumar, my friend and a very good colleague in terms of giving me support on data privacy. And he's a director of compliance at Darwinbox, where he lead the team that keeps one of the India largest or fastest growing HR tech platform aligned with 27001 RBI guidelines, SOC 2, GDPR. With more than a decade in security, governance, and privacy, Vasant turned the paperwork into the practical guardrails and helping the engineers, practitioners bake protection into every new feature. Welcome to Vasant. Vasant, welcome to the show. Let's deep dive into the today podcast. We're going to cover about DPA or ROPA, data privacy. I think that can be a perfect blend of this masterclass, which give a great practical insight to the aspiring DPOs, how to drive this ROPA, DPA, and all that. So, welcome, Vasant.
Thanks, Prabh.
Guys, this is Sunday, and the Sunday is the time given to the family. But this guy has taken this initiative, do this podcast on Sunday. That's a big thing. Giving back to the society, it's a big thing. And coming on weekends, sacrificing our family time and giving back to society is a big thing. So I really appreciate this kind of people who come forward and do the initiatives for giving back to society. So Vasan bhai, good to see you. Uh, good to see you second time virtually.
Yeah.
You already faced my torture for 6 days, so yeah. But now, what we are going to make it this podcast special?
Okay. Hey, thanks again. So let's deep dive into DPA. I'm a compliance InfoSec guy from a
Hmm.
GRC and transformed into InfoSec and privacy compliances. Currently, Darwinbox is a kind of global leading HRMS tech platform. We have our data subjects across 130 plus countries. So I lead kind of a InfoSec and privacy team where I have exposure to all the privacy laws and practically implementing it. So I think this will give me an opportunity for the audience to showcase what is the kind of exposure or what is the kind of experiences that I can share with based on my expe
That
experiences so far. Yeah.
and I think you had a very good brand name in the market for the data privacy mentor and all that. And there is no when it comes to the requirement of integration, validations, or when it comes to the requirement of understanding key pointers about data privacy and all that, there's no competition of yours. But there will be some people who watching this podcast might be not from a technical background. So we will basically start from completely zero, which give them a great insight. And your first student will be the Prabh Nair, who making a lot of notes, and you get a very wrong student. So this student is basically asked so many questions. So please bear with me, because these
Yeah.
are not my questions. These are the questions on behalf of the listeners.
Yeah. So let's start with what does an organization need in terms of privacy for what are the kind of agreements that which is getting signed. So
Yeah.
I front end compliances and closely work with legal. There are multiple documents that we signed with legal as part of the requirements. So DPA is something I want to start with. And what is the difference between DPA and what is the difference between the SCC? And what are the other additional requirements which comes as part of these requirements. So let me share my screen and let me share through a few information. I thought I'll do that. Just give a minute.
So I believe, Vasant, you're directly coming to the practical, which is really, really great. So my first question is basically, before we jump into this, what is DPA? And as you said, it's framework and all that. Is it? Can you just guide us from zero why we need this and what we're going to cover today? Yeah.
Okay. So before diving into DPA, let me give you a process how every company works. So you will have a vendor or a other company who will support you to perform certain services. So any of the services will be done through contracts generally. But DPA comes in place when you do a processing where a PA is involved, which is personal identifiable information.
Hmm.
In terms of processing, how the data needs to be processed, what all the controls needs to be implemented. right? So all this information, or including the technical measures, information security requirements, okay, all this information will be captured in the data processing agreement. DPA itself, it's called data processing agreement, which is helps and a controller and the vendor, or controller and the partner who helps the controller to enable a, a better processing with the security and privacy requirements being implemented. So two, it will makes the processor become liable, and it will also have liability obligations, right? So which will help the controller also to have an upper hand in terms of managing the processing activ activities. Yeah.
Okay. But when we say this
So
processor and controller, can you just guide us on this topic? What do you mean processor? What is mean by controller?
okay. So controller is, let's say, you are doing services,
Hmm.
like training services,
Hmm.
right? So you will have your students' data. Let's say you use a learning management system platform to have your students' data. There is a learning management system which has the students' data in those applications. So you become a controller because you have the data, and that students will become data subjects, and the learning management system will become your processor. The application which the service is being provided, that will become a processor, and you become a controller because you define the purpose of processing. You are a controller. You want the data. Though the data subjects want the data, but the data subject have to give a consent for you in terms of using your services or your training or the learning management system application, right? So data controller will become infosec train, and data processor will be the learning management system application that you will use it,
Okay.
and data subjects is your students.
Okay. And then what is the role of DPA here?
Okay, DPA is when infosec train, let's say for example, all right, so it makes an agreement with the learning management system application provider. I do not want to name any provider here, but when
Infosector
you
you can
make
take.
yeah, okay. InfoSec Train is a, let's say, I don't have two different names. So controller is InfoSec Train, for example, and LMS provider, if you can take,
Darwin.
let's,
Let's take example
uh,
Darwin. Yeah.
okay, Darwin is an LMS provider, for example, right? So Darwin will become a processor to you.
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
so to have a control on what data needs to be processed, right? So InfoSec Train and Darwin will have to get into an agreement saying that I will process the data in certain uh, way. This is the way I should process it, right? Then it will tell how secure the data will be as part of the processing.
Okay.
And anything additionally apart from the purpose which is defined by InfoSec Train, which will not be done apart from what it has been defined. So let's say you want to process only the student data with the name, email ID, number, for example. So the LMS provider should not go and ask what is your Aadhaar card or what is your PAN card, what is
So
your
scoping
passport
has been
number.
defined.
Scoping,
Scoping has been defined. That this is the data we're going to collect.
exactly.
We should not
And
collect more than that.
yes, exactly. But the scope, the purpose definition will be done by the
Hmm.
controller. And the processor will have to obligate as per the purpose which is being defined by the controller.
Okay. Understood.
Yeah. So this will cover as part of the data processing agreement. So I'm just trying to put it in a very high level, what all information needs to be covered as part of the agreement. So let me go into step by step approach. So the first is defining the roles and responsibility. So in apart from the contractual agreement that you have, this DPA will be a separate document, or it can be included as part of an annexure in the contract also.
Okay.
So you will identify the parties. So InfoSec Train is a controller and Darwin is a processor that has to be identified. First step. Then you have to mention the processor and sub-processor, if any. Let's say Darwin is using Google Cloud, for example, to provide LMS services, right? So then those sub-processor needs to be called out. The reason for to call out the sub-processor is you as a controller should understand where all your data is going to sit in. So I use Google GCP, for example. So this you have to understand where is your data is going to sit apart from your processor. right? That information has to be clearly defined in part of your defining in the roles and responsibilities. Okay. Third is to identify and create an obligation for what all applicable laws. Today, you
Okay.
have services providing services in India. So you have to put DPDP Act as part of the requirement. Similarly, if you have data subjects across a different country, so you have to put those particular country privacy laws under the obligation, and that obligation has to be followed, right? That obligation has to be called out in the contract
Okay.
as part of the data processing agreement. So this also has to be included.
Okay.
That is the primary uh, identification of parties and roles. Second, come to the data processing agreement. As I already mentioned, scope of processing. What is the scope to process? Define services. What are the modules you have? What are the integrations that you are going to do? So that needs to be clearly called out in the processing activity. So you are a controller. You define the purpose of processing and the scope of processing, right? And nature of the process of and the purpose, which needs to be clearly defined. Okay,
Hmm.
let's say LMS here is the services which has been
Okay.
obtained, right? So in that case, LMS for services, what services has to be clearly documented and what all the information which is being collected, right? That also needs to be mentioned as part of the DPA, which is again, which comes under, which is categories of personal data, which is name, email ID, phone number, which is need to be mentioned. The data subjects is already mentioned, which are the employees or your contractors or students, for example, here.
Okay.
That needs to be clearly mentioned as part of the processing activity.
That's great.
Yeah. So now then let's move to the consent mechanism. See, you are a controller, but you do not own the data here, right?
Hmm.
So the data subject is the person who is the owner of the data, an individual, a student who is the owner of the data. How does student data, you can obtain student data? You have to take a consent from the student
Hmm.
saying that I have a services which is LMS. If you are taking training, I have a platform where all the training sessions is being recorded. So if you want to go review the training, you can see the training in the learning management system, and you can take a quiz, and you will have certain information, passing marks, what is the criteria, what is your previous scores, and everything. Right? For
Hmm.
example, to use that, I need your name, email ID, phone number, and your registration ID or whatever student ID that it. So that needs to be obtained. And I will use only for the services, right? So that has to be taken as a consent because you are taking the name, you're taking the phone number,
Hmm.
right? So which is all PA data. So that information has to be given consent by the user before entering the platform as part of onboarding into the platform. The
Okay.
data subject has to give a consent. Then for those consent and data only, you will be able to do a purpose definition, scope of processing, and lawful basis of providing services.
Okay.
Okay. And if in case there are sensitive data, for example, so you're taking data of birth as an data which is for some security. Let's say you do not want some other user to
Hmm.
use it so randomly, right? So you want to say that, okay, put your date of birth and verify the user, right? If you want to collect the data, that is all becomes under sensitive data. And if you are using biometric or any other special categories of data, if you are collecting, that is all comes under enhanced security protection, which needs to be done. So you have to enable masking. All these requirements will come. We'll see in the further requirements. And here the processor does not determine legal basis independently, which I was clearly talking about. The
Hmm.
processor does not have an ability to determine the legal basis. So the controller has the ability to determine what services I have to give, what information I have to collect. The processor will not have any legal basis.
Okay.
And even for a controller, it is important when you define the scope of services, a processor will have to collect certain data. Let's say where is the user logging in from? Whether the user is logging in from two different places at the same time. How will the service provider will able to understand? He needs to capture certain information such as IP address or to provide MFA. They have to you have to have a mobile number. So you have to collect certain information. Those information which just comes under data minimization. So you have to collect only the information which is required to provide the services. This applies to the controller and this applies to the processor, both.
Okay.
And it is combinedly agreed in the data processing agreement. These are all the information that I will collect to provide you certain services.
Hmm.
And minimization is a concept which is required to avoid any unnecessary usage of data,
Okay.
PA data. Okay. Next is purpose limitation that we have talked about, and retention. How long you will retain the data. Let's
Hmm.
say you have a student use the services for 1 year and pass the exam, and you might retain it for 1 year for the student to revise it. But you can define in the consent, I will retain it for 1 year or retain it for 2 years, and provided after that, I will not use your data. I will
Hmm.
remove your data, delete. So that is comes under retention. So you have to retain it only for a specific period of time, or the most of the privacy laws talks about saying no longer it is necessary or as long as it is required. So you have to
Hmm.
retain only the data as long as it is necessary for you to provide the services, or no longer it is necessary, you should not retain it. Whereas none of the privacy law clearly says that you should retain it for 5 years, you should retain it for 7 years. The reason is there are multiple other laws which comes and talks about, let it be regulatory or a stat, right? It
Hmm.
will say that I have to retain it for 5 years, 7 years, depending upon various regulation, country to country, these regulation and sector specific regulations are there. So when those comes into picture, so there is no standard retention you can define. It is
Okay.
all a controller defined based upon the relevant location and relevant sector. It is basically a sector specific and it is also location specific. This sector and location will vary. Based upon that, the retention will vary to the controllers to define the retention.
Okay.
Okay, and there is no standard retention. Somebody saying no, you have to retain for 3 years flat. It is not, none of the privacy law as of now, it does not clearly says that. Yeah.
Hmm. That's a great
Okay.
insight.
Yeah. So comes again the processor aligns deletion schedules accordingly.
But
So
one
this
question I want
comes.
to ask
Mm.
is, sorry to interrupt you. When it comes to retention period and all that, there's a lot of things about retention period mentioned is regulatory and all that. So how do you see the retention? Let's say example, regulation want to retain data for 7 years. Okay, business want to retain for 10 years. Can we do like that?
See, that's what I said. The regulation says 7 years, and your
Hmm.
business want to retain it for 10
Hmm.
years.
Hmm.
What is the reason for this retention? Additional
Hmm.
3 years of retention.
Hmm.
Let's say I have a backup, okay, which will have to be retained for 10 years, for
Hmm.
example.
Hmm.
All right, you have to say that this is a business process. The reason it is not only a policy that you will have an underlying condition because I have to submit all these details for audit for the next 3 years.
Hmm.
Let's say 7 years my period, I have to retain it, but any backups which has been taken, which has to be retained for 3 years, there are regulations. Let's say manufacturing sector or pharma sector you take, they have to retain it for so and so period. It is not only, see now we are talking about digital copies and digital data, but there are industries where physically store the copy of the data which has been printed for, not in digital form also. So apart from regulation, you have to store it from business purposes also. So you can retain it. And as I clearly told, the purpose has been defined, and purpose, if it is no longer required, you should not retain it.
Okay.
And it should not violate any law as of no. And you also have to clearly categorize it. Say, let's say
Hmm.
you want to retain a data. So you should not need not to retain the entire data as part of the requirement, right?
Hmm.
You identify, I need only name, I need the email number to identify the services, right?
Okay.
For example, and let's take employee as an example, right?
Hmm.
So an employee today, after moving out of the company, if he comes and says that delete my data, I cannot, any of the company does not able to do that because they will have their own regulatory audits, their stat audits, and tomorrow the employee may come back and say, provide me proof of services of my employment. What if
Hmm.
I will delete the data? Right? So you have to delete the data for the period of time, or you have to delete the data, certain data. Let's say, for example, Aadhaar card, PAN card, all this information you can delete.
Okay.
And you have to define that categories of data which can be deleted, and
Hmm.
they define a set of data which need not to be deleted and retained. So that
Hmm.
categorization and classification is important when we talked about retention. Let it be 10 years, but you define the period, define the data, and retain only the necessary data to be retained, not all the data.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So,
That's there's always a confusion regarding uh, the functions between these two thing parameters and all that. That's the reason I asked this question, because there's always a people have a doubt regarding this area. That's the reason I asked. Thank you so much.
okay. No problem. So the next comes the processor aligns deletion schedules accordingly. See, this
Hmm.
is the very important factor for any customer, you as a customer to your service provider. You have to tell, I have to delete the data after so and so period of time. Let's say any data which is beyond 2 years.
Hmm.
Okay, where you have inactive users, you delete the data. You as a controller, you will utilize the platform, but you will not have the ability to delete the data,
Hmm.
right? So you should inform your LMS provider, and this has to be contractually in the agreement. Delete my data of my inactive users who are not logged in for 360 days or who are not logged in for more than 2 years. So you should tell them to delete their data. So this has
Okay.
to be documented in the contract. This is called deletion schedules.
Okay.
And this is not only as part of deletion schedule. To when you move out of this particular vendor, let's say you are working with a vendor called Darwin and you want to move to a different. So it is important to
Hmm.
define the retention not only for the existing data, it is also important to define the deletion criteria as part of your contractual agreement, as part of your exit process. Tomorrow
Okay.
you are moving out of your service vendor from one service vendor to another service vendor.
Hmm.
So this other service vendor has to delete the data and he should give you a proof of deletion and a proof of certificate of deletion. And tomorrow there is a breach at the vendor if the vendor does not delete, for example, that obligation will come under the data controller generally, especially in India.
Okay.
The DPDPA
Hmm.
has a act which is currently it is the way it has been written more from a controller perspective, which is called fiduciary perspective, and processor enforcement. It is only through the data fiduciary, which is the controller. So in other country privacy laws, which you see, there are privacy law specific requirement for processor and controller. But for India, it is enforced through fiduciary only. So it is
Okay.
important
What
for
is
you.
fiduciary?
Fiduciary is nothing the control. It's just a term. So
Okay.
as per the act, it is fiduciary. DPDP, it is called fiduciary,
Okay.
and where data subject is called data principal. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
That's great.
So it's just a term. It's just a term terminology. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So that it has to be included in the contract. So coming to the next one, your technical organization safeguards. Coming to the InfoSec piece of data processing agreement.
Hmm.
Okay. See, I'll tell you. See, I'm a compliance and InfoSec guy, where I'm also a DPO in the organization. I closely work with legal.
Hmm.
So the major difference between legal doing this role and DPO doing this role, sorry, the InfoSec doing this role is slightly different because where we play a major role is here, the technical and organization safeguards, where we understand the technical terms better than legal. Where the legal is, when I say better, it is they don't understand. It does not mean that they are also in the race of into this. But however, it's an added advantage for people like us, right? So
Okay.
doing the role of DPO in terms of having these all requirements and information security clauses
Hmm.
requirements coming in the data processing agreement. So
Okay.
we talked about there's a requirement, simple language. I would put up encryption. We all know data and rest data and store data and transit all has to be documented as part of the agreement. You have to
Hmm.
encrypt it. Masking, tokenization for all the information fields. Let's say you are having a name or a date of birth, you should mask the date of birth. Any of the banking apps, if you see today, it will have all the masking of your sensitive data. and supports anonymization when needed, which is, let's say, for example, if you want to do analytics, for example, to want to analysis certain information, how many user is logged in today. So you do not need to use the entire data.
Hmm.
You can use only the aggregated data, which is anonymized data, and you can say these many user has been logged in. Tomorrow you want to see how many male employees and female, male students and female students as part of your diversity in your program. You can
Hmm.
use that anonymized data. You don't need to have a named person information. So you can have an aggregated data, anonymous data, where you can use it for your analytical purposes.
Okay.
Right. So, and next is your access controls, audit logs, MFA, network isolation between one environment to the other environment. That is something which we have seen. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, and ensure adequacy. So adequacy is something about there are adequacy decisions in which we can talk about in the SCC. I'll talk about their every country where list of adequacy countries or
Hmm.
adequacy decisions. So I will work with countries like US. I will work with countries with like India. There are adequacy decisions, which means that I have a data protection law. This
Hmm.
country has a equal data protection law. I do not need a special agreement for this. Okay. So when we talk about SCC on GDPR, why there is a SCC required for a country like India, I will cover more on it. But on a higher note, EU GDPR does not have adequacy decision in India today. The reason is
Hmm.
they identified India does not have a adequate protection.
Data
So
protection
for to
requirement. Yeah.
data protection requirements. So to for that they have a special which is called standard contractual clauses.
Hmm.
So where all these requirements will be documented and where the controls will be identified, these all information you have to follow it, and they will not allow to change in or violate any of the requirements. It's basically like a rule book, I would say. So that is contractually you have to obligate
And what is the document called? You said.
standard contractual clauses.
So we in GDPR we're talking about two things. I think SCC and BCR, right?
Yeah,
So it mean,
SEC, BCR.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
yeah.
SEC is slightly, which has a broader picture.
Hmm.
Today, we are talking about controller and processor agreement, but
Hmm.
SEC, when it comes to SEC, we talk about controller to controller obligation,
Hmm.
where and one of the data controller will be in India, one of the data controller will be in other country. Okay, where the data transfer between EU
Yeah.
and India happens, right? So a cross-border data, mostly for the cross-border data transfer.
Hmm.
Okay, when there's a data transfer happening from EU to other countries outside. So where it has been identified as adequate list, those countries you do not require SCC. Countries like US, they have a EU-US data privacy framework
Hmm.
where there is an framework which US companies can get them assessed and say that they are compliant. And based on that, they do not require to go under SCC criteria.
Okay. The reason
Just
of
all.
basically asking
Mm,
this question is, and I want to stick to the previous question again, and it is always a doubt among the people. My company is my company is based out in Europe. Let's
okay.
take example. I don't want to take the name. There is an insurance company in Germany,
Mm,
and they set up the GCC in India.
okay.
There's a sales team sitting in India. They have access to the. Can they have access to the EU data, customers data? First
Uh,
question.
so, so customers data it is again you define the purpose of processing.
No,
So you are
given the
not
purpose, I want to do for marketing and all that. I have to calls because the calls are scheduled in India. So I have a
mm,
question: is can they have access to the data?
okay. Generally, I'll just tell you the flow. Just
Hmm.
add one step to it. See, the company is an insurance company who's basically a controller,
Hmm.
and the company which is there in India, which is becomes a processor here.
Okay.
Okay, so for the processor, where you will have controller to processor SEC, which is in SEC, you'll have different obligation. So this will be a controller to processor obligation, where the processing criteria will be defined by the controller,
Hmm.
and based on that, you can process the data. whether
Okay.
it is calling or marketing, whatever it is, the controller is defining the data, and yes, you are allowed to do it based on the SCC which is being signed.
Okay. And so it mean uh, if can we download like or do they have access by the VNCs and all that normally if they want to access and everything?
When can you be a little bit? Can you explain it a little
Yeah,
bit?
so let's say example right now I'm in front of my screen. I can see the PI data of the customer and all that because I'm supporting the customer queries and all that. Can I get a freedom to download the data in India sovereignty?
See, that's what I'm saying. So the hosting location plays a major role.
Hmm.
Okay. So the moment you say I'm able to see the data, which means the data is cross-border data transfer is happening. The SCC itself, which is standard contractual clause, which is primarily for when the data is being transferred outside the country. So that's what I said. It's a controller to controller obligation you will have, controller to processor obligation you will also have,
Hmm.
or processor to processor, sub-processor obligation, multiple obligations you have. That you see it in the further discussion about SCC.
Hmm.
When you download it, so this is where I was talking about the in technical and organizational safeguards. The
Hmm.
similar requirements which is there in SCC, what access a user should have, which will
Hmm.
be clearly documented. So
Hmm.
user should have access to the name and the phone number to or email ID to write an email to connect with the customer or the end customer of the controller. It is required for the purpose of processing.
Hmm.
But downloading should it be required?
Hmm.
It
Okay.
is not required for a user to download the data, right?
Okay.
So, but again, similarly, the application which is hosted, where the application is hosted for the processor, whether
Hmm.
the hosting happening in India, whether the hosting happening outside of India, I mean outside of EU. So that plays a major role.
Understood.
Irrespective of hosting is happening or not, when a user is accessing the data outside of EU, it means that the data is doing cross-border data transfer, and user have access to the PII data of EU residents,
Okay. Okay.
citizens.
And the reason of I asked this question because there's a lot of buzzword around this data transfer, data process, and all that. That's the reason I basically asked this question.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. We will talk. We'll see in the SCC discuss more on the SCC when we discuss on that.
Great.
So coming to the data subject rights. See, when we talked about data subjects, your students or data subjects, they
Hmm.
should have access to their data. They have to right to access it, right to correct. Let's say they change the phone number and they're not able to correct it. They will come and say, change my phone number,
Hmm.
right to correct. Or they will say, no, I do not require access more to this platform. Delete my data,
Hmm.
name, email ID, phone number,
Hmm.
or right to restriction. So restrict my data from further processing. Do not process further. I do not process it. You keep the data, but do not do any processing.
Okay.
Right to object. The I to restrict an object is almost kind of slightly different, but object is like do not do any processing of the data. Do
Hmm.
not involve me in terms of processing. And right to data portability. Right to data portability is give me the data, whatever information that you have about me. Try
Okay.
to withdraw consent. So I have given consent to use the services, but I do not want to use the services now. I want to
Okay.
withdraw my consent. So they will say that. So if you withdraw the consent, again, you cannot store the data, and you are done for certain services in the past, but you cannot do it further processing.
Okay. And
Yeah.
I'm sorry I asked you that bit of the topic because it connect me to some of the question which is asked by the people even in my session. So yeah, I got some good insight here.
Yeah. So DPIA roles, PIA roles, these all again comes under SCC. We can see into the SCC. Sub-processor management. These all the requirements just highly talk about DPIA, PIA roles, which is data processing impact assessment, data
Hmm.
privacy impact assessment. People call in different languages. So it is to understand what data you have, what PIA data you have, what all the fields you have, what kind of risk of having those data, with, and understanding the impact. And you do it. There are various templates. You have the template. I have all the sharing all the templates by the session, and And transparency is accountability. It is about how are you doing your privacy notices, what are the policy documentation you have, incident response plans. Okay, whenever there is a breach, how you will notify your controller. All this will be comes under transparency and accountability.
Okay.
Next is your sub-process management. We talked about using GCP or AWS or Azure for your services, your third-party services, right? Your
Hmm.
third vendor is using, LMS vendor is using certain services. So how is the sub-process management is there? How is that being assessed by the vendor? Whether the
Hmm.
vendor is looking into their third-party security, whether they are verifying their SOC report, whether
Hmm.
there is there a deviation, whether the vendor is looking into the deviation and following with their sub-processor, ensuring that is getting closed.
Hmm.
Okay, is there a agreement, valid agreement between the third party and the sub-processor, all your vendor and the sub-processor? All this being has to be looked upon, and it has to be also included as part of your agreement clearly.
Okay.
Next comes to the cross-border data transfer. Cross-border data transfer is something, a transfer mechanism. We talked about SCC, adequacy, BCRs, and DPDP. While moving to, we'll discuss all this in the SCC piece.
Hmm.
Breach notification protocol. We will have a breach notification obligation. Being a processor, a controller, you should notify within 12 hours, or depending upon this is a controller to processor obligation. In India, we have multiple requirements. So certain will ask you to notify within 6 hours for a incident, for any security incident. They will ask you to notify within 6 hours.
Hmm.
So you have to notify it. So processor generally should not notify. Processor should notify to the controller, and controller will notify the data protection board which is coming, and also to the relevant authority like certain.
Okay.
So we are a processor, for example, is part of the agreement. When the flow which we are discussing, we are a processor. A processor should report only to the controller. Controller should ideally report it to that, and individually should not take any decisions. Individually should not report any actions outside of about the controller.
Okay.
That's an obligation. Also needs to be called out in the contract. Why I'm emphasizing here it is because this is a requirement need to be called out in the contract very
Hmm.
clearly.
Hmm.
Tomorrow, some regulatory requirement comes asking about your data to the processor. A processor should not have an obligation to give the data to that particular regulator.
True.
They should come and reach out to you, and you should have the ability to understand whether it is applicable to you, what is the need for the ask that you will define, and you are the only person should have the eligibility to share the data.
Hmm.
Processor should not do any action on their own. They should only report it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, that obligation has to be documented in the contract.
I was not
In
in
audit,
impression. I was thinking, okay, automatically someone will take the accountability and all that, you know, and based on that, we can do that. Glad I got this information because this need to be documented. I was not aware about that. Thank you so much.
mm, it's fine. Okay. So next is about the breach notification, auditing,
Hmm.
and monitoring rights. See, there are companies or vendors that you might work with. See, you will work with vendors like AWS, Azure, where you cannot do an audit, where you will rely on their security obligations and their SOC reports and their ISO certificates.
Hmm.
Right? You understand their security obligations through them. And there are vendors that the kind of vendors that you work with where you have to go and have an audit rights because they might not have the necessary security requirements or necessary security reporting, let's say SOC report, they might not have. So how do you ensure that their security is being maintained? So frequent doing an annual audit to
Hmm.
understand their obligations. Are they meeting their obligations? So you should have an audit rights. When you foresee there is a risk of SOC reports are not available, ISO certificates are not there. So how do you ensure that there's a third party governance which is in place? So you have to have an audit rights and audit monitoring rights. This has to be documented in the contract.
Okay. That's a great
Yeah,
insight.
that is a very important point. So tomorrow, if you go and ask for an audit, they will say, no, we have not agreed for it. Right.
Ah.
So yeah. So how do you enforce these security obligations? And how do you know that security obligations are met? Unless if you don't have a SOC report or through a third party or a ISO certificates, 27001 certificate, for example.
Hmm.
Okay. Next, come to the data return and secure deletion, which we are talking about previously here. about deletion schedules. So it is about surrendering back the data. So
Hmm.
you should surrender back to the data to the your controller. So as a processor, it is a responsibility that also needs to be clearly called out in the contract. Upon termination or expiry of the contract, the processor should surrender the data and delete the data. It is not only giving the data back, it is also important to delete the data, which is secure wipe and certificate of destruction.
Hmm.
Then comes governing law and liability. This will anyway, it comes as part of your contract. Define the jurisdiction, dispute resolution method, and liability caps and mutual indemnities. This
Okay,
is covered as part of the contract anyway. Yeah.
that's great. And
So next, can we go to
I believe in this section, jurisdiction basically play a very important role. So I want to spend little bit time on the jurisdiction side. When it comes to jurisdictions, how do you see the jurisdiction as a practice when it comes to the requirement between the India and US or India and China or India and Europe and all that? So as a DPO, aspiring DPO,
Hmm.
I personally believe that okay, he should focus more on 14 point and I think can you if you scroll up a little bit, cross and 10th point. So how do you see as a DPO? And do you have any stories where you face any challenge when you're dealing with jurisdictions and this cross border and all that?
Yeah, okay. So see, it differs from the type of services which is being provided from one vendor to a different vendor.
Hmm.
So take Darwinbox as an example, right? So
Hmm.
we have we are a SaaS based product.
Hmm.
So for us, we will have hosting capabilities in multiple countries. We have different entities also in
Hmm.
other countries, which is so in this case, for example, right? So you have US based customer, and
Hmm.
it is depending upon where the contract getting signed.
Okay.
Okay, when a contract is signed between an where an entity where a company does not have an entity presence there.
Hmm.
Okay, for example, I'll just say InfoSec Train want to sign a contract with a service provider, LMS service provider.
Hmm.
Okay, you are an Indian, you have an entity in India, but the service provider is in US, for example. You do not have an entity in US. What you obviously do, you have to sign it on your India.
Hmm.
Okay, so you have to sign with your Indian entity. Jurisdiction, if you are a SaaS-based vendor or product-based vendor, the vendor will choose the jurisdiction based upon the nature of the services because see, it has to be on it is a mutual discussion, and it is mostly if it is SaaS, the vendor has the ability to choose the jurisdiction, or
Agree.
it is a mutual discussion.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm. Okay.
yeah.
And do we need to involve the strong advocate in this section? Because if you are a beginner and you can want to take some insights and all that, is it a good practice to involve that advocate in
See,
that case?
this is not only for the data processing agreement.
Hmm.
Okay, this is up for all for all the entire contract parameters. So whether it's a service availability, we talk about SLA, whether it is about the necessary third-party integrations that you do. So a lot
Hmm.
of contractual obligations place it. It is not only for a DPA, it is for a larger picture for the contract. So when it comes to jurisdiction, it's not only for DPA. So
Hmm.
DPA, where it is getting covered to answer your query, it is covered at the initial stage itself. If you see the your roles and applicable laws. So
Hmm.
irrespective of which data subject is you have to, whether you're hosting in India, whether you're hosting in a different country, what all the data subjects are present, you should have the relevant um, privacy obligation to be documented. So you
Okay.
have US based clients. Okay, you have to mention that it is CCPA, CPRA. You are obligated. You have to obligate. So when you mention that, irrespective of where your jurisdiction it is, you are making the processor liable for those compliances.
Okay.
Okay, it has nothing to do with jurisdiction here, but it plays a major role at the initial level itself. What all applicable laws?
Hmm. Excellent. So what is special next? What is our next thing you're planning to cover?
We can do SCC
Hmm.
quickly. Okay. So SCC, as I clearly told out, we have discussed most of the things. We're talking about module 1, module 2, module 3, module 4. So SCC is primarily, which I can see it is for um, a transfer of data outside of EU.
Outside of
Okay,
EU.
for
Okay.
outside of EU.
Hmm.
The reason is the multiple module, which is I've clearly called it out. So if you are a controller, you are obligating another controller. Let's say you have an office in Europe and you have an office in India.
Hmm.
Okay, you want to transfer your organization data, which includes your employee data also,
Hmm.
right? So though it is comes different entity but comes under the same umbrella, but there is a cross-border data transfer which is there.
Okay.
So it is becomes a controller to controller agreement where here it is where the BCR will comes in place, binding corporate rules. So it is an agreement in simple term. I'll just tell in a very simple way. So I am sharing my employee data from my Europe entity to an Indian entity. Uh, and I will sign a BCR and get this B saying that this is all the information I will process. There are templates. I will share these templates also. So in high level, between a controller to controller is where BCR comes in place.
Hmm.
Okay. So next is controller to processor, which we talked about DPA, how the DPA, so that is where controller to processor model. Third is processor to processor, and fourth is processor to controller. So different module structures are there.
So before I jump into this, I still want some clarity on the um, a minor difference between the SCC and BCR. Do we need
Mm.
both or do we need one? And what is the role of DPA with these two things? If you explain in a more non-technical manner, yeah.
Yeah. See, DPA is mostly a processor agreement, which I say data processing agreement. It is between a
That's fine.
controller to processor.
Fine.
Okay. BCR is between a controller to controller where an internal group entity data transfer happens. Let's say there is one entity in Europe, one
Hmm.
entity in India where the
Hmm.
data it is happening,
Hmm.
and generally goes through BCR.
Hmm.
Okay. It does not need to go through the entire SCC.
Okay.
BCR has
It's
to
the
go
same
because
company. That's the reason.
it's the same company, but it's altogether a different entity altogether.
Example
Okay,
like TCS India and TCS
TCS Germany.
or Darwin India or Darwin Germany.
Yeah, for example, right?
Okay.
So it is process is not only for one arrangement. Generally, the
Hmm.
process is for multiple arrangement. So I have to share it with my insurance provider. I have to share with travel and expenses. I have to share it with multiple other partners. So generally, it is a combined arrangement. It will say these are the data sets I will share it for these are the purposes.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And why they say that okay, BCR is more challenged than PCR is more challenged than SCC in terms of
Okay.
enforcement and all that? Because I always get confused with this. See, we are transferring within a same entity, different entities there. We know in and out, and becoming a challenge in that case become a concern. On the other side, they're saying that okay, if you're dealing with external third party company and you're
Hmm.
building the SCC, then SCC is easy to do that, easy to manage, like, easy to enforce and all that. So why they talk about that, and I never get a clarity on this area.
So these are all the binding corporate rules which has been approved by the EU for the data transfer.
Hmm.
So you have a controller to control processor agreement also within the same entity. I mean, same organization, I mean.
So it's a public document which is available on the BCR sites.
Yes, it's a
Yeah.
public document.
I want to go a bit off the topic here before I jump into the SCC and BCR part. What is the process? Like example, we have a company. As I said, we have a company head offices in EU, GCC in Hyderabad, and we decided we
Okay.
want a interboard data transfer. Okay.
Okay.
We have decided we need to go for this BCR and SCC and all that.
Hmm.
What is a step-by-step process?
Okay. See, on a high level, let me explain you.
Hmm.
See, you have decided it is not only for one purposes, first
Hmm.
thing. So you have to do it multiple other obligation within an organization. You would define. I have the BCR templates. I can share it across at the end of the discussion. So it will clearly mention similar to a PAA what data it is going to transfer, what is the categories of data, which needs to for the purpose and against what article and all you have to mention. And this goes for approval, and then it gets approved and it goes through the BCR process. Okay.
Hmm.
See, generally BCR is slightly complex process because it goes for the authority to get approved. Okay, it
Hmm.
takes time consuming process. So most of the places where which we see is it's a processor controller to processor where people use as a SCC method to get it uh, signed through the standard contractual clauses. They do a
Okay.
transfer impact assessment. Okay, and which all the countries where it is one is transfer impact assessment, which is international transfer impact assessment. They do ITIA. Okay, understand the exporter, understand the local law, risk evaluation, safeguards which they have, and adequacy also is there. And there are certain countries will have blacklisted countries or geopolitical reasons they will not work with multiple countries, for example, right? So these all factors plays a major role during the transfer impact assessment.
Okay.
Okay, for similarly for India, see yet to come, it might be either blacklisted countries or whitelisted countries, for example, where you will work with certain countries for data transfer.
Okay.
Okay, this is all part of the data transfer impact assessment. It will come. Okay,
Fine.
so coming to the obligations of data exporter, and it's as we discussed similarly, purpose limitation, documentation of processing requirements, data subject rights and oversight, and suspension powers.
Okay.
Okay, and next to that, it is the slightly not visible. One more. Data importer obligations. Okay. Encryption during transmission. You have the data which will transfer it has to be encrypted. Access control authentication, security assessment, incident response procedures. And organization measures, which is your confidentiality agreement, processing documentation, regular audits,
Hmm.
breach notification protocols. See, whatever we have seen in DPA, it is as similar to that, but slightly in an elaborated way. Okay.
Hmm.
So in again the U data exporter, data transfer chain management, which is basically data exporter,
True.
third country importer.
Hmm.
Okay. Permitted onward transfers, whether it is the same SCC recipient, identical clauses, or you have adequacy decision, which we talked about, which country to transfer, whether that it doesn't require SCC or not, if the adequacies can be maintained.
Hmm.
Okay. Safeguards, which we talk about, encryption, all those things. Organization safeguards, which is NDA, BGB, etc. Okay. So just quickly running up, the reason is we have discussed this already.
Hmm.
Safeguards of security and privacy requirements, whether it is anonymization, data minimization, encryption. You talk about whether in some cases pseudonymization is required because you try and do a testing, for example. So all these controls or security requirements has to be identified as part of the transfers,
Hmm.
whether it is allowed as part of processing and legal necessity and explicit consent when there is a when there's a cross-border data transfer happening. So there's an explicit consent will also be taken when do as part of processing. The data control will say that right, okay, we will process the data outside of the country, okay, as
Hmm.
part of the services.
Hmm.
Okay. Okay, when the transfers will be prohibited, when you do not have a safeguard in place, whether it is organization safeguard or technical safeguard. Okay, inadequate protection levels, whether the data is not protected, conflicting local laws, where when we talked about adequacy decisions, or
Okay.
blacklisted countries, right, where you do not have an obligation, or due to geopolitical reasons, also people say that no, we will not work with. Tomorrow we do not know what will happen.
Hmm.
There are issues. We do not want to do a hosting in this particular country, for example, right? So
Okay.
all these decisions will be done. Done as part of the data transfer impact assessment. So you doing that, you will understand whether are you good to go to a transfer in particular country or to a processor or not. So that
Hmm.
will help you to understand, and then followed by the compliances, okay, regular monitoring and corrective measure if there are any observations. Frequently monitor their SOC reports, or you do vendor audits. Okay. And if you still see there are no observations, either you have to suspend the vendor and terminate the vendor. Okay.
Okay.
Which is we talk about escalation, breach notification, law changes, government requests, which we all this compliance failures, which we talked about.
Hmm.
See, I have made it a little minimal here because most of the pointers we have already seen in the data processing
Okay.
agreement.
And this is will you share this as a template so I
Yeah.
can share in the description box?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So this is like a DPA agreement. Okay.
Yeah. This is the DPA agreement, which generally covers all the requirements. Okay. And I'll show you the standard contractual clauses also, how it has been covered. So this link and all the documents I will share.
Hmm.
This is the DPA agreement. This is in the official website also. Okay. Next, I'll talk about data protection impact assessment, which is a key parameter as part of your, whether it is a controller or a processor, it is important. It gives a step-by-step process how to do a data protection impact assessment. You will have the templates also. You can use this to perform your privacy impact assessment.
Hmm.
So starts with the nature of starts with the need for DPIA
Hmm.
and this nature of the processing, scope of processing, what all data, then comes to context of the processing and purposes of the processing
Okay.
and consultation process, necessity and proportionality, and identify and assess the risk. So based on the assessment, you can, it's similar to in a risk register, how do you identify a risk? So it is a similar way of identifying and assessing the risks.
Okay.
And you will include that and get this reviewed with your privacy and infosec program function.
And who signed this?
So generally DPO does that.
Hmm.
Okay. So it will be done by the privacy team and DPO signs it.
Okay. That's look great.
Say, for example, say you as an organization, you want to understand what are the controls which are applicable. This is multiple privacy laws, which I've put it some for or almost around 25 to 30 countries I have put it now, right?
Hmm.
So you understand each and every country involved. You see, we put GDPR because it started in 2016 with GDPR. Before that, we are not talking about that.
Hmm.
But if you see, it talks about the clarity. It gives you clarity here
Hmm.
for the users, for the audiences,
Hmm.
to understand how many countries have these data privacy laws. What I have done is
Wow.
only 30% or 20%, I would say.
Hmm.
Each
So
country has data privacy
you're planning to
obligations.
release it in public or what exactly?
Um, we can share. This is the
Hmm.
self-made document.
In the
Yeah.
future, if it's finalized, so will you share this on LinkedIn?
We can. I can do that. That's not an issue. Mm.
Hmm.
I can share it. See, this is just my work of collecting because this just helps to me in my day-to-day work to understand what are the obligations.
Hmm.
See, let's say I as a processor, okay, there is one customer who's coming and saying that I want to comply with certain country laws. Okay,
Hmm.
so what will I do? I understand what are the country laws, scope, what is their definition, what is their principles, and what is their rights.
Hmm.
Okay, will I able to achieve it? Primarily in terms of whether a cross-border data transfer is allowed or not. See,
Hmm.
every company or either as a controller or processor, they will not have hosting capabilities in all the countries of their clients, right?
True.
So they should have hosting capabilities in certain countries like US they will have, Europe they will have, Singapore they will have.
Hmm.
So what are the implications of doing a cross-border data transfer? Whether cross-border data transfer is allowed. There are certain countries like China who has limitations of cross-border data transfer, right?
Hmm.
So you have to understand the obligations before moving into an agreement. So you should understand the requirements. So this is something which made itself to understand each and every country specific requirements. What are there?
Hmm.
Okay, to understand the obligations. Cross-border data transfer, consent requirement, data breach notifications. Okay, how much time you have to notify the data controller. So this is basically data subject notification for 72 hours, where a controller obligation, but as a processor, you should notify to the controller to achieve that. So there are obligations that you have to support your controller in achieving that as a
Okay.
processor, for example. Yeah, from a processor standpoint.
And it is good to have such kind of a documentation because, sometimes what happen, you are in a BRD meetings and all that, and they ask you about the adequacy and everything. At least you can follow this document to
Mm.
track the requirement of different country. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Exactly. And you also have to understand the geopolitical risk. You have to be keep updated. You should have some platforms to get any notifications when there is a change in the laws. Okay. So and also country specific, for example, Southeast Asia customers prefer hosting in Singapore. Okay, because they have a MOU with Singapore, Memorandum of
Hmm.
Understanding.
Hmm.
So all these parameters as a DPO should also be aware of what kind of information, what kind of hosting can be done, where can be done, what is preferred by the client. So all this that will come as a practice to start as a DPO. Initial, you have to do a lot of work, and then you will know by on the go. You will come to know. Yeah,
Excellent. And
yeah.
that's a really great insight you have shared on this. So, when it comes to the requirement of this BCR and SCC, I have one question here is what are the things we have to review before getting into this kind of a contracts?
So this gives you a clarity of the requirements of SCC, like what we talked, third party beneficiaries, which we talked about. Okay, let's quickly move through. Okay. The more interesting part, data protection safeguards. So same language we discussed in data processing agreement or SCC discussion. It talks about data transfer controller to controller method. What is the purpose limitation? What is transparency, accuracy and data minimizations, storage limitations, and security of processing. If it is sensitive data, which is called special categories of data, onward transfers,
Hmm.
processing under the authority of the data importer, documentation compliances. Okay, so this is the kind of a controller to controller method. Now goes to controller to processor method. Same purpose limitation, transparency, accuracy, duration of processing, erasure of return of data, which we talked about in DPA also. Security of processing, all your technical safeguards, organization safeguards, sensitive data handling. Okay, this is all special categories of your data. Racial, ethnic origin, political
Hmm.
opinion, religion,
Hmm.
philosophical
Hmm.
beliefs, trade union membership is a genetic data or biometric data. This will require an additional protection, right? What additional? So let's say if you are using a social security number for processing, whether you have a data is encrypted, but how additionally you are protected because it's a sensitive data or special categories of data. So what is the additional mechanism? I use masking, for example. The data only last two-digit number is there, or entirely the data is being masked. So that is the weightage that you give for additional processing of data, special categories of sensitive data,
Okay.
onward transfers, documentation compliance. This documentation compliance includes your processing impact assessment, data privacy impact assessment, transfer impact assessment, okay,
Hmm.
and your DPA, the SCC signed agreements, all this will comes across. And if there are third party assessment which has been performed, those documents also comes under that. And this is the processor model. And this is a standard contractual clause which talks about. So what you need to do as part of the requirements.
Okay. So
And
much
coming
to
to the
read.
data subject, yeah. So coming to the data subject rights. So key principles when talk about, I'm just going back to this. See, these all from a processor perspective, which I have. Okay.
Okay.
So purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy of the data has to be maintained,
Hmm.
retention has to be maintained. This all has to be documented in the contract also.
Hmm.
Security of the data, accountability of data, transparency, lawfulness, and fairness
Hmm.
of doing. So to avoid biases in the systems, right? So similarly, data subject rights has to be supported or right to be considered and clearly documented. Right to access the data, right to correct the data, right to delete it, right to restrict processing, right to object of processing, right to data portability, which we talked about. You want to move from one vendor to other vendor, right to withdraw consent to avoid further processing. right?
And
So
if you
all
notice,
these
like one thing, all our countries have a same principle, but there's a change of the pattern.
slightly change the
Slight change
pattern.
in the pattern,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
Exactly, exactly. And where primarily certain countries like Russia or China will happen is on your cross-border data transfer, whether they
Okay.
will allow or they will not allow. Okay, and there are DPO requirements locally. There are very few countries have a DPO requirement locally, and countries like Philippines, okay, where NPC is as a requirement. Even if you are a processor, you have to register it there,
Hmm.
right? So there are representation requirements which we never talked about, right? So representation requirements are there, and countries like Philippines will have a NPC says that you have to register and you have to have a seal of registration. They should know
Hmm.
which countries are operating with the countries in their country, right? Which country or which yeah, it's basically country and the vendor. Yeah,
Hmm.
they will have the visibility.
That's a great insight, to be frank, and it also giving that information that um how do we see the information about. See, one thing I understood, like, keep it simple. There's a lot of complexities there, but keep it simple. So let's have a last point, which I want to understand from you is correlation of all three things: SCC, BCR, and DPI in a 1 minute summary.
SSC, BCR, and DPA.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, I'll just create a flow. Okay, SCC, then BCR and DPA. You already told in that flow only.
Hmm.
Okay. Okay. SCC is a standard contractual clauses which will give a broader view from a GDPR perspective.
Hmm.
Okay. Tells that whether you are a controller to controller model or controller to processor model, what kind of obligations that has to be made in the
Okay.
contractual agreement.
Hmm.
So I have to follow certain principles.
Hmm.
I have to follow anonymization. I have to follow masking. I have to follow encryption, AES-256 or whatever method it is, right?
Okay.
So all this technical organization safeguards, including data retention, deletion, data subjects, supporting data subject rights, all this will be covered as part of SCC
Okay.
requirements. This includes as part of your controller to processor or controller to controller or processor to processor obligation, whatever. And in
Okay.
addition to that, it will also talks about your sub-processor obligations also. You have to document who is our sub-processor, what is a privacy notice, okay,
Hmm.
whether a privacy notice is explicitly called out. All this needs to be looked upon. Whenever there is a change in your sub-processor, how do you notify that sub-processor? All this will be covered as part of SCC. SCC is a broader picture. So BCR, it is for, as I clearly said, it is for an internal purposes between one entity of same organization, one entity to another entity. This is will be shared. And DPIA is to understand what data that you process,
Hmm.
okay, whether what kind of impact it will be there, what additional controls needs to be done.
Okay.
Let's say, for example, if you are storing social security number, as I
Hmm.
already called out, what is additional security? You're encrypting the data absolutely fine. Today, if the encryption is not enough, right? So there are regulations which is talking about bring your own keys. There are regulations which are talking about masking by default. So these all, it will keep evolve.
Hmm.
So today, what we are talking about, it will not apply down the line the next 3 years or 5 years. This will change. So those requirements which will be understandable when you do this assessment year on year basis.
Hmm.
And this is important for you to do at least minimum of an annual one assessment to understand whether the um, scope has been increased, whether there is
Hmm.
a change in the nature of the processing, whether there is a the threat landscape has been changed. Okay, all this to understand. It could be any reasons. Yeah. So
Understood.
that will help you to identify the necessary controls and put adequate safeguards in addition to the what you currently have.
Hmm.
So that summarize SCC, BCR, and DPIA. Yeah. You
And
can
today
also
after
add,
that, today after
yeah,
this, I got a lot of clarity on this uh, um, topic, which is basically talk about correlation. But now I can confidently speak about this. Yeah.
yeah, good to know.
Hmm. And when it comes to the requirement and all that, you know, integrations and everything, how long it will take to prepare this inter-board data transfer agreements and all that? If we talk about the
See,
approval process and all that.
generally these are templates.
Okay.
Okay, so we have seen these agreements happened within 1 week to 1 month also,
Hmm.
depends upon. Okay, it varies from organization to organization at simple it is. Okay, so there are these SCCs or standard templates which are available where as part of your contractual, this will again with the contract it will go.
Hmm.
Okay, and what it takes time is when there is a cross-border data transfer happening, the controller and processor obligation understanding the necessary requirement, because when this happens, it is not something that the hosting location could be different because it's in a lot of scenario changes whenever when there is a vendor change happens,
Okay.
right? So it is not same from one vendor to another vendor. You have to assess the each and every vendor when you move it. So you
Hmm.
have to understand you have to do a DPIA, you have to do a transfer impact assessment as from a controller perspective I'm talking about. So understand what necessary security measure the processor has.
And the reason of asking this question is because, I need that visibility on the area of integration part and all that, because it does it take more or does it take less? So that's the reason I was talking about, how this entire process works. That's the reason. Thanks.
See,
Yeah.
no, okay. Okay. See, one last point, which I want to call it out. It depends upon nature of the processing of subjects. Okay.
Hmm.
When I say nature of processing, it could be one vendor or multiple vendor, or it could be one entity or multiple entity data subjects. So it will be
Okay.
from different countries also. So because you have to undergo different approval. See, when you have
Hmm.
a larger entity, enterprise entity, you will have data subjects across multiple countries and
Hmm.
multiple entity data has to. So Europe will give the data to India entity, for example, and Singapore will give the data to India entity. Likewise, the data will be consolidated and given to one entity for processing. Or
Okay.
data will be given to like group. So Southeast Asia customers will say that I work with the in Southeast Asia region, and this certain customers will say I work with hosting in India. I'm fine. So the vendor has to have an system where you do group it into different sets,
True.
and the contract has to clearly call it out, okay, which entity where you are hosting it. Okay, so it takes time. Okay, it depends upon, it will vary from different perspectives and types of processing. Yeah,
Hmm. But thanks, Vasant Bhai, providing a great insight on the sections. And is it okay? Can we disturb you again for another masterclass where we're going to cover about DPA, how to
happy
practically
to
prepare the organization for DPDPA? And those who watching this podcast, do let me know in the comment box. Those who are very excited for the DPDPA masterclass with Vasant. And thanks, Vasant, for sharing a great insight about the DPA and SCC and BCR. And thanks for helping out to clear the concept on these areas. Do you have any last minute statement you want to say before we wind up?
okay. So thanks, Prabh, for inviting me for the session. Okay,
Hmm.
so it was nice connecting with you once again. Yeah, hoping, looking forward to connect again. But for the audience, see, it is not a myth. It all comes in a practice. For people who are existing there, we have different kind of role people. One, we have a legal set of people who are in DPO roles, and we have infosec and compliance people who are in DPO roles. So we look forward uh, and combining. We'll see what happens in the future.
Okay. Yeah, you're saying something. Continue. Yeah.
Yeah. So So what I'm saying is today there are different roles within the organization. Legal takes care of contract, and InfoSec and compliance also doing a DPO role. And there are certain places legal takes a DPO role.
Hmm.
Okay, so the added advantage for InfoSec to do a DPO role, a compliance person to do a DPO role, is they understand technology. So this is something which is an added advantage and privilege to work on this. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, that's
Okay.
something which I want to highlight. Yeah.
And it's a question which is called rapid fire. We have seen a lot of trend around DPO and CISO role as a one. Do you think so? It's a good to have one person to have both roles? If yes, why? If no, why?
Okay. See, the answer is see, before responding to that, let me clarify that.
Hmm.
Okay. Any role that you take, okay, I will call out the maker checker model.
Okay.
So,
I'm making a notes for that.
yeah, maker is someone who implements, who decides what needs to be implemented, and as part of operational.
Okay.
And checker is something from a governance layer. If there is a difference in the CISO role, who is not uh, into the implementation, who's
Hmm.
not into the implementation, who is in the governance layer, who's sitting outside, and there are technical functions which are in multiple teams are technical functions separate, but CISO act as a governance role. When
Hmm.
it comes to governance, CISO and DPO can be same. Not every organization able to afford CISO and DPO separately.
Hmm.
CISO and DPO can be same as long as both person
Hmm.
do not interfere and implement in technical decisions.
Okay. That's
So
good.
governance layer matters.
Uh,
So if you step out from governance layer to the implementation layer to a maker model, then
hmm.
it cannot be the same. Yeah.
Okay. That's really great. And but why then company going for this kind of an authority where I'm sorry, some CISOs is watching me, like, going to bash me in the comment. Some CISOs I can see acting like a role of both. Wasn't thinking my weekend is going to be spoiled by this guy.
And no, see, this all depends upon organization,
Uh,
right? So if you look into enterprise organization, they will have different privacy function.
uh,
Okay, each department has a privacy function also. Each department has an information security champion.
uh,
Okay, upon the organization, how it has been defined within their structure,
uh,
organization structure.
uh,
Okay, but if you ask me, if somebody in the governance layer, it is well and good
okay,
to handle CISO and DPO. Okay,
okay,
why some organization is doing something, it depends upon the organization to organization,
hmm,
which I couldn't comment. Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
But
So,
thanks for sharing that insight also.
thank you. See, thank you, but it's all depending upon uh, the you have to have a separate salary given for the. I'm thinking whether to comment
Yes.
it or
So
not.
by end of the day, business matter.
Yeah, business matters.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But thanks, Hasan bhai. Thanks for sharing the great insight on this session, and I'm sure people will love this podcast. We're looking forward for more videos, more sessions from you, where you can share the more insight on this section.
So,
So this is all from our side, team. Do let me know how do you find this podcast. Um, if you find this podcast useful, do share a suggestion and comment, and do let me know in a comment section what is the next video shall we make. I can disturb Vasan, but I have a complete right. He's my friend, and I can ask him anything on the data privacy. He will be definitely there. That is his nature all about. So I will use this opportunity. I'll ask him more question on this area. Do let me know what is the next video shall I make with Vasant on any new topic on data privacy. Do you want a DPDPA? Type in the comment box. Do you want to discuss about GDPR? Let me know in the comment box. This is all from our side. Thank you so much for watching this particular video. And if you're new to the channel, do subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to make sure you should not miss the future videos on a similar topic. Good day. Bye. Thanks, Vasan bhai.
thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.